Welcome to the Harry Ransom Center for this year's Don Davis Lecture, which brings to campus scholars who study the collections of knowledge, manuscript, print, and digital alike, that together form the cultural record that we study as humanists. It is named after Donald G. Davis, Jr., who served as faculty in UT's own School of Information from 1971 until his retirement in 2005. His own research, appropriately enough, focused on the history of libraries, the history of collections. I'm of course glad to see all of you here during UT's spring break, no less, but I'd be lying and probably a bad host if I didn't admit that my real pleasure tonight is welcoming our speaker, Adam Smyth, to the Ransom Center. He arrived in Austin yesterday on a direct flight from the UK, where he serves as Professor of English Literature and the History of the Book at Balliol College, Oxford University. I should also let you know that Adam has earned the privilege of appending FSA to the already impressive list of his academic initialisms. For those not in the know, FSA means Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, which was founded in London in 1707, a true British venerable institution. When he's not busy accumulating titles, Adam keeps himself plenty busy with writing and editing, sporting a curriculum vitae too impressive to recite to all of you tonight. I'll just give you a taste of his activity before sulking off the stage in the face of our speaker's grand accomplishments. He's written 4 solo monographs: Profit and Delight, Printed Miscellanies in England, 1640 to 1682 from 2004, and I was told when he was working on the dissertation from that, he did a Ransom Center Fellowship back in the early 00s. His second book, Autobiography in Early Modern England from 2010, then Material Texts in Early Modern England, 2008, which was the runner-up for the DeLong Book History Prize from the Society for the History of Authorship, Reading, and Publishing, and the book, of course, that he'll be speaking a bit about tonight, The Bookmakers, A History of the Book in 18 Remarkable Lives, 2024, with a UK paperback reprint last year, and I'm told this year a US paperback reprint. Very exciting. I dare say, in fact, that the last of these, given the paperback reprints, has managed to find an audience beyond eggheads like me. And I haven't asked him, but it's even possible that Adam has been able to buy a copy of his own book with the royalties from a paperback edition. And it's found that audience very deservedly. I'd also like to direct you to a book he edited with Dennis Duncan called Book Parts, which came out in 2019. It features chapters by some of my best friends and my smartest colleagues on topics such as title pages, tables of contents, running titles, and for the grad students in my seminar this semester, page numbers, catchwords, and signatures. I'm especially fond of Adam's own contribution on errata lists. In addition to currently working on an edition of the underread play, Pericles, for the newest Arden Shakespeare series, Adam continues to edit a creative critical journal he co-founded, Inscription, the Journal of Material Text, Theory, Practice, History. It's a wild experimental publication with issues so far on beginnings, wholes, folds, touch, and containers. And last but not least, would Adam be anybody at all in 2026 if he didn't also have a Substack? With the confidence that only an Oxford professorship could give you, it is titled simply Text, exclamation point. And with that exclamation of my own, I'll shut up and let you hear from the reason for tonight's talk. Adam, please take the stage.
Thank you so much, Aaron. What a great, long introduction. I think you got everything in. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much to the Harry Ransom Center for this invitation to come and speak. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks to Aaron and Erica and Grace in particular for making everything really easy and smooth. I'm going to talk today about the history of the printed book, both the long arc of the printed book from about 1480 to about today, but also much more locally about a quartet of men and women who did new, exciting things with the book at particular moments in time. And as Aaron said, I'm going to be talking kind of around and about a little bit the bookmakers, a history of the book in 18 lives, In England, for some reason, it's called A History of the Book in 18 Remarkable Lives. That got dropped over here. The American understatement. Now, this book had a number of origin points, and I wanted to start this evening by thinking about one of those origin moments when the book came into being. As you were hearing, I teach English literature at Oxford, mainly 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, most often, to really wonderful undergraduates. So lots of Shakespeare, lots of Christopher Marlowe, lots of Margaret Cavendish, lots of Ben Jonson, John Donne, Lawrence Sterne, and others. But at a certain point of teaching those literary texts, I realized that in order to understand these works of literature, I needed to learn how the writing was produced and printed and circulated and preserved. I needed to think much more about how the literary imagination got out into the world and was read and consumed. I needed to know how printed books were made and how they work as objects. So, with a couple of friends, I bought a second-hand Model 4 press, a late 19th century, extremely heavy press, letterpress technology, and I put it in a barn next to my house. So broadly the same technology that Gutenberg introduced in Mainz in the 1450s, which means, as you know, picking out individually cast metal characters made from lead alloy, arranging them into the page shape required, applying ink and then pressure via a press, producing as many copies as needed before returning or distributing the type back into compartments ready for the next setting. Learning to print was messy, as you can see here. It was hard, it was slow, and the process was a continual dance with error, mistake, blunder, even embarrassment. We printed lots of sonnets, principally because they're short literary form. Here's a first proof of a poem by my friend Leanne Strauss that we printed. Came back with 11 errors. So we'd circle the mistakes in red, as one does, then reset the type, put the upside down U back so it becomes an N, mind our P's and Q's, and we'd print another proof. And 11 errors had become 5 errors, but somehow 3 new errors had been introduced. And so we'd proceed in this way, each new printing leading towards what we had imagined, but never something perfect or absolute. The whole process profoundly analog. We experimented a lot, including with writing surfaces, printing surfaces. Here's the start of the book of Genesis. We were quite pleased with the type. We tried it on a paper towel to see how that came out. And as we did this, as we experimented with printing as a means to understand how books worked as objects, we began to think of words less as signifiers of meaning, but as physical units. And to print means, we came to realize, thinking less about the literary themes, perhaps, or symbolism, or the narrative of the text. And it meant instead thinking about letters as little blocks in space that need placing, tightening, lining up. Printing is a continual battle with entropy. You're dealing with letters that threaten all the time to fall on the floor. Now, in 1926, Virginia Woolf wrote a fantastically interesting lecture entitled "How Should One Read a Book?" It's about the nature of reading and the strangeness of that activity and what we do when we think we read and how we should proceed. And she wrote it in 1926, a few years after she got interested herself in printing and set up the Hogarth Press with her husband, Leonard Woolf. And while they were learning to print as amateurs, unambiguously as amateurs initially, through the 1920s, before proceeding to print much of the modernist literary canon, while she was learning to print, she wrote this lecture about how should one read a book. And as we read her words, this little excerpt from that great text, you can detect the way that Woolf's literary imagination, her sense of words, is being powerfully shaped by her experience of printing. This is what she says: "Books are not turned out of molds like bricks. Books are made of tiny little words which a writer shapes, often with great difficulty, into sentences of different lengths, placing one on top of another, never taking his eyes off them, sometimes building them quite quickly, at other times knocking them down in despair and beginning all over again, knocking them down in despair. This is a printer's description of language, a bookmaker's conception of writing. And I would like to talk this evening a little bit about some bookmakers who have shaped the history of print. Now, there are many ways of organizing a history of the book. We can choose different objects and establish different relations between those objects. And there is always a politics to those decisions. Which text do we center? Which text do we marginalize or obscure? How do we develop a language of tradition and influence and so on? These are political decisions. One conventional way of telling the history of the book is to process past a series of bibliographical monuments, books both physically and culturally massive and resonant, like Gutenberg's Latin Bible of 1455, and Diderot and D'Alembert's Encyclopédie from 1751 to 1772, or John James Audubon's The Birds of America from 1838, which you know better than me, and William Morris's Arts and Crafts edition of the works of Geoffrey Chaucer from 1838. Now, these are all riveting, important, fascinating books, undoubtedly. But I want to take a different, and I hope more surprising route this evening. And I want to think about 4 moments of experiment in the form of the book. About 1490, first of all, about 1630, about 1909, and then about 2026. In the course of moving through this quartet of moments of experiment, I hope to make the case for why print matters now, and to make the case that print can do things that the digital contemporary cannot. So let's start somewhere not quite monumental, but rather more scrappy, with this sheet here. What are we looking at? What can this tell us about print and books and printing and writing? Well, the first thing to say is that this isn't a book. It's a fragment of a book, 2 leaves, each printed on one side, and it has had, as you can see, a rough time. The pages are stained, battered, torn, imperfectly patched, fragile. It's from a long time ago. It was printed at a shop called the Red Pale in Westminster, London, 534 years ago in 1492, the year Columbus sails to the Americas, the year the Jews are expelled from Spain, the year the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella complete the Reconquista against Muslims. The fragment comes from a work titled, you can see underneath, a little treatise called The Book of Courtesy. It's a guide for children, for how children should behave in 1492, written in verse, addressed to a universal John, and intended to steer its childish reader towards virtuous conduct. It tells you how you should behave as a child in the last decade of the 15th century. Avoid rough games and violent sports. Eat moderately. Say your prayers. Look people in the eye. Play the lute. Some parenting tips survive history less well than others. And more than anything, and you can see it on the right-hand side of the page, read, and again, and again. Read John Gower, read Geoffrey Chaucer, read Thomas Hoccleve, read John Lydgate. I'm thinking of telling that to my 8-year-old child. 14th and 15th centuries writers working in English, suggesting our reader John is more every child than aristocrat, and conveying also the beginnings of a sense of a tradition of literature in English rather than Latin or French. Now, as you can see, the page on the right has verse celebrating some of those English authors. The middle line of the second stanza, readeth my child his books all. And on the facing page, on the left as we look, there's the colophon in the middle. Colophon from the Greek for summit or finishing touch. A little description that tells us something of the nature of the book's origins. Here endeth a little treatise called the Book of Courtesy, or Little John, in printed at Westminster. There's also the symbol of the printer, an elegant W and C, but this emblem or device, curiously, is printed upside down. Something seems to have gone wrong here in this printing. So what we're looking at is a printer's proof, a trial print designed to help us spot blunders, like the error-bedecked sonnet I produced with my friends on my press in the barn. Once it had been scanned on a day in 1492, and this upside-down emblem detected, these pages were discarded, thrown to one side as scrap. But, and this is why it survives today, one of those contingencies on which book history depends, a binder working on another book reached for these unwanted pages and used them as waste paper to line the inside covers of another book. And so this fragment, discarded in 1492, precious to us now, survived within the kind of building of another title. Now, this was a common practice in the 15th and 16th centuries. Lots of pages of torn up, discarded books ended up being recycled in this way. And the leaves you can see here are stained with the glue that once stuck them into a now lost host text. The survival of this fragment, the only extant evidence of this edition of the Book of Courtesy, is a happy accident of the unknown binder's work. In a paradox of popularity, all other copies of this publishing hit were read to pieces. And this mistaken, misshapen fragment is the slender thread that remembers this guide for children from 1492. Now, the printer's emblem has a W and a C, but William Caxton was dead by 1492. The book was in fact printed by a former junior of his who had learned his skills under Caxton and who, in a gesture of affection, admiration and savvy marketing, persisted in using his master's emblem on his own texts. We know that printer, if we've heard of him at all, as Wynkyn de Worde. I'm just going to say a few brief things about de Worde as my first instance of someone experimenting with the book as a form. De Worde's a crucial origin point for printing in England in the late 15th and early 16th century. He published more than 800 titles. He's prolific. About 15% of the entire known printed output in England before 1550 is associated with de Worde. So he's a crucial figure. And he's interesting for three reasons. Let me give you three reasons why I think he's worth thinking about. First of all, he's an immigrant to England. He learnt about printing working in 1470s Cologne and Bruges, and only belatedly settled in London. And in this, he's thoroughly representative of early print culture. Probably the first printer in Oxford, Theodoric Rood, around 1481, lugged his type and press from Cologne to Oxford. Richard Pynson, who became in 1506 the official king's printer, was from Normandy. And even Kentish-born William Caxton travelled as a merchant overseas, where he spoke French and Dutch in Bruges and Ghent. So the beginning of printing in England was an immigrant story. That's point number one. Second, de Worde had a new skill that became important in the world of print. And that skill was the ability to understand the desires and aspirations of readers he had never met and would never meet personally. De Worde understood the disseminating potential of print, its capacity to reach readers beyond the coteries of manuscript circulation. And we can see that this in his publishing list. De Worde published perennially popular grammar guides, about a third of de Worde's surviving output, religious works in English, handbooks to devotion. He was particularly good at widening the appeal of previously learned, even daunting books, translations of Latin works into English that appealed to would-be humanists with rusty Latin, like his compact little volume of Cicero's On Duties, On the Best Way to Live, printed with facing pages of Latin and English. And his chronicles of history, useful if you can't quite remember whether Egbert came before or after Ethelwulf. He published husbandry, works on husbandry and guides for caring animals, jest books, ballads, and almanacs, almost all of which are now lost. Poetry and imaginative writing and medieval romances and what we'd call today, but not then, literature, which meant works by Chaucer and Stephen Hawes and John Skelton, ballads and romances, and travel writing, like Mandeville's Travels from 1499, an account of a knight from St. Albans journeying to Constantinople, Jerusalem, and China. We should probably call it a story, a mixing of existing tales and fantasies and armchair dreaming. Mandeville's work had been a big preprint hit since the later 14th century in England and northern France, and de Woerd's task was to transfer across media from manuscript to print this already popular title. So the refrain running across many of these publications is de Woerd's capacity to redirect texts that had already been popular, often in manuscript culture, towards a non-elite readership of print. Here's a page from one of my favorite texts associated with de Woerd, The Ship of Fools. It's an English translation of Sebastian Brandt's big European hit from 1494, Narrenschiff, published by de Woerd as The Ship of Fools. And lots of you will know this text, I'm sure. It's a satirical treatment of folly, a guide to foolishness. The text gives us a taxonomy of kinds of foolishness spread out across 112 chapters. So, the drunkard, the gossip, the hypocrite, the untrained doctor, the corrupt judge, the actor, the flatterer. Musicians seem to have been particularly irksome at this point. Here is one of de Woerd's representatively beguiling woodcuts of a group of players of instruments, each of the musicians manqués wearing their giveaway headpieces complete with ears. That's how you can tell the fool in the images throughout. And their song, if you look carefully on the left, their song inducing not acclaim, but only the emptying of a chamber pot. And here's a type of fool that may be painfully familiar to all of us here. The bookish fool, seated at his desk with his reading glasses and his disordered pile of books. The fool who buys books without reading them, de Woerd prints. Oftentimes, the text says, passing the time in beholding the diversities of the coverings without finishing the text. Now, the copies that survive of de Woerd's Ship of Fools are often in a battered state, read to pieces or marked with handwritten annotations suggesting the book was a favourite. Here's one in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. William Cripps owneth this book indeed. So a third and final feature of de Woerd's books. De Woerd was a tremendously visual printer with a love for images. Early English printed books were mixed text and image. They were hybrid affairs in that sense. And de Woerd learnt from the sophisticated visual presentation of text by continental printers, but de Woerd worked fast and was quite happy to take some shortcuts. And here's an example of that. And I think this, the degree to which de Woerd's personality is felt or vivid or available in his printing comes out, I think, in these moments of worldly workarounds or shortcuts. Here's an image, again, a lovely image from The Ship of Fools, chapter 37. We're reading about the fool who is impatient in sickness, who's too eager to want to be well. That's chapter 37. And then 15 chapters later, we come to foolish physicians, another kind of medical disorder. But it's the same image that's appearing in this later chapter. De Woerd has reused the same block. Here's a fool in terms of how they read the stars and the future. And then a little later in the same book, the same image appears, the fool who dispraises the joy eternal. This was thoroughly de Woerdian. Not ideal, but thrifty, speedy, streetwise. A woodcut block is an expensive piece of hardware, so better to reuse blocks already in-house than buy or commission new ones. And today we might see these visual repetitions as problematic or dubious kinds of shortcut. But in fact, this kind of image recycling was common in print across the 16th and 17th centuries. So, printed sheets that survive because they were used in bindings as other books. De Woerd's talent for redirecting already popular manuscript works into print in English. His worldly speed and decisiveness. keep those things in mind as we go to our second moment of experimentation. And I want to jump forward in time a little bit, if I may, to our second bookmaking group, to a tiny spot outside of Cambridge in England, where in the 1620s, a very charismatic man called Nicholas Ferrer established a Protestant religious community. Ferrer turned his back on academic and political success and persuaded about 30 members of his extended family to create something like a miniature domestic university, a kind of Anglican monastery, in a field with a dilapidated manor house and a broken down church, which had served in recent years as a pigsty and a farm building. There was nothing else within sight except grazing sheep, who are still here now, and a single narrow lane. Now, Little Gidding, which is the name of this small location, Little Gidding is best known today, of course, as the title of the fourth of T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets. And in that brilliant poem, Eliot describes his visit to Little Gidding and a sense of the place as a secluded end point to any number of journeys. Eliot writes, "And what you thought you came for is only a shell, a husk of meaning, from which the purpose breaks only when it is fulfilled, if at all." But Little Gidding is important for book historians because it was the site of a remarkable experiment in print, and I just want to dwell on this for a few moments. The pious religious community Ferrer established around about 1630 was based around a daunting daily service of devotion, beginning with a bell at 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. for those indulgent winter lions, and centering around 3 church services. Family members took part in vigorous moral debates, prayers, songs, reading, sewing, and, crucially, bookmaking. The books they made were, to our eyes today, strange, even provocative objects. The books were made primarily by Ferrer's nieces, Anna and Mary Collett, and they're the names that are central for this Little Gidding 1630s experiment in bookmaking, Anna and Mary Collett. What they produced were biblical harmonies, which means big, lavish folio volumes produced by scissors and glue. Anna and Mary obtained printed texts of the 4 Gospels delivered by carriers from bookstall browsing relatives in Cambridge or London, and then using scissors and knives, they sliced these texts up, often on a word-by-word level. So they bought the printed Gospels and then with scissors and knives cut them up into clauses, sentences, words. And what had been printed books were sliced and separated into sentences, spread out on the large table in what they called the concordance room. A door left open by a careless younger brother and a gust of wind, and the word of God was fluttering through the air. Anna and Mary reorganized the text. They bought the print, sliced it up, and then reorganized the 4 Gospels, distributing and gluing the pieces of the Gospel under 150 chapters, which told the chronological story of Christ's life, and glued in images cut from prints or sometimes from other books, many of them imported from abroad, trimmed and reworked, and sometimes conflated to produce something that would later be called collage. And what they were trying to do, what they were pursuing, was harmony between the 4 different accounts of Christ's life in the 4 Gospels, achieved through this process of cutting, reordering, and gluing. So this is a page from a Little Gidding harmony made around about 1635 by Anna and Mary Collett for King Charles I, who visited. It's now in the British Library. It's a huge, imposing volume, about 3 feet tall and heavy, more garden furniture than devotional handbook, but a magnificent object. And the section here you have is the 13th of the harmonies, 150 chapters. Maybe you can work it out. The resolution isn't spot on there, but you can see what's going on there. It's the 13th of 150 chapters and presents a description of John the Baptist's preaching. And so to produce this chapter, Anna and Mary selected the gospel texts that narrate this particular moment, parts of Matthew, parts of Mark, parts of Luke, and then taking their scissors and knives, they cut up these 3 accounts and on this page arranged the text in 2 different formats. On the left, the comparison, you have 3 columns of text aligned to produce a kind of parallel edition of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, so you can read, but you can read in such a way that enables comparison, seeing the differences and similarities. And then in the composition on the right, which is the really interesting moment, I think, all the words from the 3 different gospel accounts of this description of John the Baptist are interlaced, kind of reordered and placed together to create a single piece of continuous prose. So this is 3 accounts harmonized into one. And here, if we just zoom in a little bit, you can see this a little more clearly. You can see the conflated account here, and you can see that fantastic cut and paste aesthetic clearly, a form we're more likely to associate with a Ransom note or a Sex Pistols album cover. Now the cutting up, you can see, it's sometimes at the level of the individual word. So this is about fiddly scraps of paper that are hard to pick up, glue, searching for the scrap that's flipped over, but it's also at the same time about organizing an account of the life of Christ. You can probably just about make out the superscript MR. I'm going to use my exciting green dot. There we go. MR at the start of the text. This means that the ensuing words come from Mark's gospel. The L, a couple of lines on, it recalls Luke, although there is just one word there, now. We're looking here. From Luke before the text switches to Matthew for in those days, before flipping back to Luke for in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. And it proceeds in this way. Now, 13 harmonies like this survive today, scattered across locations including the British Library, university libraries in Oxford, Cambridge, Princeton, Harvard, Ickworth House in Suffolk, and Windsor Castle too, where it's difficult but not quite impossible to get access to look at this thing. And for the history of the book, if we're interested in the history of print and the history of the book as a form, these little getting harmonies are paradoxical objects. Super interesting to think about, I think. They are printed books, but they are also each unique copies, each one distinct. They are made by hand using knives and scissors, but those blades were not instruments of destruction or censorship or attack. The slice of the knife was a kind of pious reading, I think, a way of considering and manipulating the word with care. And so if print seems to offer the potential for quickly producing many copies of the same book, for quick duplication and quick duplication of the same text, and seems to offer objects that might be light and mobile and portable, then these printed harmonies are working to produce a very different sense of what a book might be. Now, the Ferrers were making these big folio harmonies in the 1630s and 1640s. They sold Little Gidding a few generations later in 1760, and their library largely vanished in the way libraries seem to do. But bundles of papers descended to Magdalen College, Cambridge, including thousands of letters and a collection of about 800 loose, unmounted prints. In other words, all the stuff that they were using as they were making these wonderful harmonies and lifting the lid today. And for about 150 years, these boxes sat in Magdalen College, Cambridge, and no one quite knew what they were. But if you lift the lid today on those, it's like tumbling back into 1630s Little Gidding. And what is inside are things like this, a printed border of roses, which they bought to frame a never completed central harmony scene. So the text that they were going to deploy but never did. Or a print of The Last Judgment after Martin de Vos of Antwerp, but with the shapes of 2 sheep cut away, you can see here. Those sheep were included in harmonies to illustrate the biblical text. But these are the pieces left behind when Anna and Mary Collett were making their handmade cut and paste books. These are the in-process scraps that survive. And one gets a vivid sense of a vibrant, complex textual operation that has been packed up suddenly, but which might resume at any point. There are also letters too in this archive from the 1630s and 40s, recording the traffic of goods into Little Gidding, all kinds of stuff coming into this secluded bookmaking experiment, conveyed by unnamed servants, touching the cake and capons, I suppose it best to send them by page, an old cloak, some glasses, figs, almonds, prunes, but also lots of bookmaking stuff arriving too. There are descriptions of the arrival at Little Gidding of a bundle sewed up in canvas. That's a bundle of different prints, I think. A service book with a cover of blue velvet. A little box of several letters or characters and printer's ink, which must be laid over the letter by a ball of leather. And even, in July 1633, a press. Perhaps a printing press, or more possibly a standing press, used to press pages after prints and pieces of text had been glued down onto paper. Now this is the noise, I think. This is the acoustic of books being made, a kind of contented, buzzing chatter of people certain in their religious faith and sure in the rightness of the books they were making, even if they seem to our eyes today strange objects. So from this world of cut and paste devotion, I want to vault forward to November 1902 at Hammersmith on the banks of the Thames, where a man possessed of a furious temper and a volcanic ego, but also a commitment to what he called the book beautiful, has just printed an edition of Milton's great poem of the Fall, Paradise Lost. This was Thomas Cobden Sanderson, founder of the famous Dove's Press in the first decade of the 20th century. You can see the beginning of his edition of Book 3, of his edition of Paradise Lost. This is Book 3, where Milton invokes his muse. Hail, holy light, offspring of heaven, first born. Now, Thomas Cobden Sanderson was a follower of William Morris and the arts and crafts movement in England in the late 19th century, before breaking to form his own bookbinding and printing workshop, crucially built around tradition, anti-industrial craft skills, or pre-industrial craft skills, called the Dove's Press. And the press produced 40 editions between 1900 and 1916, each consisting of between 225 and 500 copies, with most printed on paper, but a handful on vellum. Now, I love the clean, uncluttered type of that page on your right, the sense of calm and space it generates, and also the red initial and book number, added by calligrapher Edward Johnson, who would go on to be the designer who designed the typeface for the London Underground in 1916. Across the total print run, almost 4,000 of these handwritten initials were penned into the printed text, and their power lies in the way they are clearly the work of the hand, not the press. They are, if we zoom in on that capital H, they are very slightly imperfect, but better for this, vividly summoning a human presence. And this is how Edward Johnson, the calligrapher, who added these forms carefully one at a time, this is how Edward Johnson put it in his brilliant text, Writing and Illuminating and Lettering from 1906. The beauty and quality of versal letters, in other words, decorated capitals like that H, the beauty and quality of versal letters depends very much on their freedom. Touching up or trimming after they are made is apt to spoil them. And when good letters are made with a free hand, minute roughnesses, which are due to their quick construction, may be regarded as showing a good rather than a bad form of careless workmanship. Minute roughnesses. Now, it's apt, we might think, that these flawed handwritten letters convey Milton's poem about the fall of man, about error, about transgression. But other Dove's Press books on other topics were similarly the work of both the printing press and the hand. Here's the amazing opening of Genesis from the Dove's Press Bible, which was made in 1904, looking very unlike the copy we printed in my barn on a paper towel. The gorgeous plummeting red initial I is a capital letter, but it's also a kind of annotation in the margin, marking out the whole text as worthy of note. And here's the beautiful initial capital flourish at the start of Cobden Sanderson's Hamlet, printed in 1909, the W of "Who's There" in flowing green ink, signals Cobden Sanderson's investment in the skilled and patient work of the hand in the early 20th century, and also connects these Dove's Press books back to traditions of medieval manuscripts. And I think there's an important idea here for Cobden Sanderson, that great books as physical objects had the capacity to slow down time, to slow down reading. And they do this partly because of the care that went into their production that remains legible as we read. Now, Cobden Sanderson printed 300 copies of Paradise Lost on paper, priced at 3 guineas, about £85 today. Even more spectacular than the paper were the 3 copies that were printed on vellum, with the first page lettering of title, author, and of, added in raised, burnished gold, of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world. Now, in the production of medieval manuscripts, gold lettering was a luxury with a particular purpose, a mechanism for lighting up, the literal meaning of illuminate, the page. And for scribes producing manuscripts between about 700 and 1200 CE, this gold was added either as leaf, beaten to the thinness of tissue, or as paint known as shell gold, because it was often kept in a mussel shell. The gold was layered over a base of plaster of Paris, which caused it to rise up from the surface, straining beyond the page and dazzling, particularly after burnishing with a smooth stone or an animal tooth. Now, Cobden Sanderson wanted to make books in the 20th century that were also the product of late medieval craft, to stand in defiance of what he saw as a machine-led contemporary. So Cobden Sanderson was drawing on these very vividly present pre-industrial crafts to make that case. And so his books, in a super compelling way, I think, flicker between different historical periods at the same time. They seem to occupy different moments of time as a consequence of how they were made. And I think this is an important feature of Dove's Press books. They seem to occupy simultaneously different historical moments. As a hybrid of the handwritten and the printed, his Paradise Lost recalls the very earliest printed books. Here's, of course, one of the 48 surviving copies of the first major book printed in Europe, the Latin Bible of Gutenberg, printed in Mainz in 1455 by Gutenberg, Johann Fust, and Peter Schoeffer. This founding book is a mix of printed Gothic letters, which look quite a lot like handwriting, and a lovely hand-drawn selection of coloured illustrations of the natural world. Falcons and sparrows perched on flowering tendrils, monkeys clambering up vines. Now, it's tempting to organise book history as a tidy progress through time, things getting better across a series of superseding moments and epochs, from manuscript to print to digital. But books are much more interesting temporal objects than that, I think, refusing that kind of punctuality. Gutenberg's earliest printed books and the even earlier culture of medieval manuscripts hover alongside the Dove's Press Paradise Lost as both precedents and partners. The effect of Cobden Sanderson's book is to summon up these earlier traditions as presences that are more substantial than ghosts, a mingling of 1455 Mainz and 1902 Hammersmith. I'm going to take a sip of water now. There's a similar kind of blurring, I think. Dove's Press books turning back to the late medieval, even as they appear in the world in the 20th century, in the typography. Now, Cobden Sanderson's Dove's type, which we can see here, became famous for its clean elegance. And these are some of the original letters. They're in this rusty condition for a particularly fun, compelling way, which we can talk about afterwards if you're interested. There's a remarkable story about them, which some of you may know. But the Dove's type uppercase letters were designed to resemble letters from the 1470s. Nicholas Jensen's letters from the 1470s, from 1470s Venice, you can see these on the left, in his printing of Pliny's Natural History from 1472 that Cobden Sanderson bought at an auction in 1898. And you can see that alongside some Cobden Sanderson printing. So Dove's Press books are, in a way that I find very interesting, purposeful anachronisms. Books that deliberately don't quite fit in their moment. Ways of refusing the drift of technology at a time when industrial book production was developing fast. So my final instance of book experimentation involves a leap forward to the present. But I want to keep in mind this sense of printed books hovering between periods as we move to the contemporary, to a defiantly papery form of publication. And I want to conclude with the zine, which some of you will know a little bit about. And by zine, I mean a self-published, self-distributed, non-commercial little magazine, usually the product of Xerox machines and informal hand-to-hand distribution. Like Anna and Mary Collett at Little Gidding in the 1630s, zine makers use scissors, knives, and glue to reorder the printed environment around them, to change the sense of the possibility of culture. Before looking at a particular example, I just want to draw out three aspects of zines and zine culture, three qualities that zines possess that seem to me important in their history and also in their future, and how they work and what they can do. So three qualities about zines before moving into a particular, I think, very exciting contemporary example. The first quality is collaboration. Zines are naturally collaborative forms, produced so often in the past and in the present by groups, collectives, not individuals. Any history of the zine as a form is a history of working together. Zines have one origin in sci-fi fanzines of the 1930s, publications like The Comet from Chicago. They gained popularity in the punk scene of the 1970s with do-it-yourself photocopied publications like Sniffing Glue from the Centre, published by Mark Perry in 1976. And they boomed in the 1990s with feminist and queer zines, particularly those associated with the riot girl movement, such as Bikini Kill, most famously, with an accompanying band of the same name, started in 1990 by Kathleen Hanna. Zines do many things, but one thing they always do is they represent collectivity. They push back against a model of the single author, of the individual as creative artist, of the singularity of voice. The second quality zines possessed is what we might call the politics of form. And by that I mean the materiality of zines, their physical makeup, what they feel like in our hands, is one of their most distinctive features, and that materiality has a politics. Zines are often the product of scissors and glue and stab stitching and Xerox and risograph machines. And we see all that as we read. They are works of collage, of non-linearity, of knives and blades. And there's an intimate relationship between the materiality of the zine, the staples, Xerox, the aesthetic of disruptive juxtaposition, and the zine's long-standing commitment to political disruption, dissent, inclusivity, and critique. Riot Girl zines define themselves in opposition to a mainstream media dominated by a small number of global conglomerates, a publishing world understood to be exclusionary, repressive, and technocratic. Zines, by contrast, are light, mobile, quick, alert, urgent, present. They are anti-ponderous, anti-pompous, anti-slow. And they move through the world decisively, pass from hand to hand. And the third quality of zines is, I think, a sense of process. Zines make the process of their own making visible to their readers. We've seen zines coming into being as we turn the pages. We see the staples, and because of this, zines invite us in. On a fundamental level, this is the message of zines. You can do this too. And this commitment to democratizing rather than mystifying bookmaking is powerful and central to the zine as a form. Zines don't stun readers into a silent or baffled consumerism or connoisseurship or a kind of passive admiration. Zines encourage readers to become makers. Now, the example I want to zoom in by way of conclusion is from the work of Black Mass Publishing, a group founded in 2019 in New York by Yusuf Hassan as part of an attempt to redress what Hassan saw as the lack of representation of black artists, writers, and bookmaking in contemporary publishing. Black Mass zines combine photographs from archives with printed poetry and prose, meditating on aspects of African American culture. Most of them are Xeroxed, stapled or sometimes sewn bound, the size of a small paperback or less, and relatively short, typically about 16 pages. And they're printed in edition sizes of 15 to 30. The decision about how many copies to print of each work is a practical question of resources. We find a lot of old paper, Hassan said when I interviewed him, sometimes at flea markets, and the edition size is based on how many sheets of paper we have. So sometimes we have just enough for 20 books. The zines have a kind of urgency, which I think is super interesting. There are works on jazz, for example, on the architecture of Ghana, on African-American cowboys. But here's my favorite Black Mass intervention. It's Nigerian Pottery, 2022, by Hassan's collaborator, Kwame Sorrell. So this is a Xerox facsimile of much of a catalogue of Nigerian pottery published in 1970, written and edited by Sylvia Leith Ross, published by Ibadan University Press in Nigeria. So this is a 1970 scholarly catalogue, printed in 1970. Leith Ross's book provides images and descriptions of pottery in everyday use across Nigeria, based on holdings from the Jos Museum in Nigeria, lamps and incense burners, cooking pots, multiple mouth pots, and more. But Leith Ross's book from 1970 did something that books shouldn't do. It went out of print, it became static, immobile, and expensive. This is a valuable work in all senses, but it wasn't moving. And so Sorrell's response was to this problem of immobility, this text that wasn't getting around, was simply to borrow a copy, Xerox it without the introductory essays, bind the new pages with string, stamp it with a colophon, Black Mass Publishing, Jamaica, New York, 11431, and relaunch it into the world. When Hassan spoke to me about this remediation, he saw a commitment to speed and moving on as fundamental to zines. We don't necessarily have time to keep printing over the same material. It's like on to the next because we're interacting with information so rapidly and we're distributing information so rapidly. We are constantly, on to the next topic, on to the next subject. Copies were made with that sense of urgency at the time, at that particular moment. So if you were kind of around to be able to get one, or you were in close proximity to get one, that's just what it was. Now, the physicality of these publications matters to Hassan. The cheap paper, the unnumbered Xerox pages, the staples, the string bindings, the stamped colophons, and also more fundamentally that sense that these are objects for the hands. Now, I've suggested that one quality of books is their capacity to recall different eras, to flicker between moments, in the way the Dove's Press Paradise Lost was caught between the first decade of the 20th century and earlier late medieval traditions. And I think a 21st century zine has a lot more to do with earlier publications too. And I want to look just very, very briefly at a juxtaposition between a 17th century pamphlet and this 2020s zine culture I've been talking about. And you can perhaps see what I mean here. This is Shakespeare's Richard II, the sixth quarto of this popular play about a collapsing monarch from 1634. In fact, a copy here at the Ransom Centre. And you can see some zininess here, I think, in this pamphlet. Thread that passes from front to back near the gutter edge, through the hole made from a binder's awl, the off-centre placement of text, the curled pages, the general sense of a light and mobile text that has lived in the world, accruing the names of former owners, including, on this page, as the play begins, the name of the fascinating mid-17th century book collector, Frances Wolferston, who deserves a full lecture in her own right. You can see some of those physical connections, perhaps, in that juxtaposition between now and then. Now, a final point on which I'll finish. I said at the start of this talk that one origin point for writing The Bookmakers was my experiment with a printing press, learning how to print, producing with friends those early blundering books, the mess, the errors, the improvisation. A second origin point came when I was in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, reading a big folio copy of Poems and Fancies from 1664 by the magnificently singular Margaret Cavendish. Now, Margaret Cavendish is interesting for all kinds of reasons. As a scientist, the first woman to attend a Royal Society meeting, as something like an early modern celebrity, Pepys was obsessed with her, and as the inventor of something like science fiction writing, too. So I'm midway through Cavendish's poems from 1664, sitting in the library, when in the margins of a page, I see a dark smudge on the right. I look closer, it's ink. Closer still, a blurred fingerprint, parts of the swirling lines just about visible. This is a fingerprint of the man who printed the book in 1664, probably. An accidental left behind signature. And for a moment, when I was looking at that fingerprint, the process of this book's production was momentarily lit up. The print shop of William Wilson in 1664, the noise and the paper windows and the stink, a pressman plucking sheets still wet with ink from the press, and before hanging them to dry on high strings running across the room, touching mistakenly an inky finger to the margin of the sheet which, after drying, folding, stitching, binding, was acquired by the Bodleian Library, and which, after a gap of more than 350 years, I am peering at now. Now, the fingerprint doesn't summon into being the nameless print shop worker who had held the page, but it does let me see that Cavendish's book is what it is, which is a physical object made by a little group of individuals at a particular time. And it's a moment that emphasized to me a kind of doubleness that's fundamental to books. Books convey text, of course. They carry romances, tragedies, comedies, histories out into the world. But books are also objects, material things that move through time, between owners, in and out of libraries, enduring moments of reading and decades of neglect, and which accrue the marks of their journeys, the signatures of ownership, the inky fingerprints, the book plates, the damage. If we learn to read these material signs correctly, books can tell us a story of their own making too. Thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you very much, Adam. So we've got not very many minutes, but what I would like to do is, if I can see through the fog of war here, take two questions, and then you can assail Adam during the reception. But let me put on my night goggles here.
Can't see anything.
And see who we've got. Do I have a question? Somebody damn well better ask one.
Can I ask myself a question?
I know, we can always, exactly. Oh, there we go, look at that. Okay, I feel more dignified. What do we got? Yes, in the back.
You talked a little bit about the specific typeset that one of those authors was using and how it kind of burnished or it had gone coppering. Yeah, the dove printing one. And you said that there was an interesting story behind that.
Doves.
You have time to go through.
Thank you. No, that's a great
Solid.
question. Can I put a slide back? Is that possible?
You can make it happen.
Oh, great, thank you. So we're with Thomas Cobden Sanderson, who was the guy with a beret, first decade of the 20th century, who developed this beautiful doves type, modelled on those Venetian late 15th century examples that became really famous and produced, well, you saw some examples of the printing. So he was working with a partner called Emery Walker, and he was increasingly anxious about what would happen to the type after his death. And he was particularly anxious, Cobden Sanderson, that it would be appropriated by precisely the kind of mechanical, industrialized bookmaking process that he was all about opposing. And he was haunted by this and left this strange fever dream diary describing those fears, and had lots of legal wranglings with Emery Walker, tried to establish that it wouldn't be used for those purposes, but didn't trust posterity, and so decided the only thing to do was to dump the type in the Thames. And type is very heavy, and he had a lot of letters, a lot of lead letters, and so what he would do each day is take and experiment with different kind of ways of carrying it, a kind of bundle of type, walk along the Thames towpath at Hammersmith, and reach the bridge that's still there, and then threw the type into the river. And I think he took 170 different journeys until he got rid of the whole lot, was sunk to the bottom of the Thames, which was kind of amazing. And he kept a diary which described quite precisely what he was up to. So spool forward about 90 years, this guy called Robert Green, who was a designer from the east of London, was interested in the Dove's type, and it kind of reconstructed what it might have looked at based on the printed marks in the books, but didn't have any examples of it surviving. But then realized that the diary gives quite a precise account of where he stood and the sunset and so on. So he went to the Thames at that point on the right day and reached down and went like this and lifted up about 7 or 8 letters in the first attempt. And so recovered, went back with some divers, and recovered dozens and dozens of pieces of type. The bridge was bombed by the IRA in the 80s, and so it's thought that some of the type got locked in at that point into the concrete, and so can't be recovered. But lots of the letters were recovered, and the designer produced a digital version of it, which you can see online, which is the most anti-Cobden Sanderson thing you can imagine. And there it is today, kind of rusted but sort of magnificent at the same time. Thank you for asking that. It would have been sad not to tell that story.
Do one more. Somebody. I know you have, and you're champing at the bit. Yes?
Maybe a strange question, but
Perfect.
We know so much about the techniques and technologies of bookmaking throughout history. There are still people pushing the envelope and using even these arcane technologies. We have a gorgeous bookstore here in town called Alienated Majesty, which is one of the most obscure and bizarre collections you'll find anywhere. I mean, it's a true gem. You'd be well served to visit while you're in town. But a lot of the books are by small publishers who are using very strange technologies that are just extremely pleasing to the eye, to the hands. You've published a book for a broad audience. I held it in my hand out there. How does it feel for you working in today's time with these, let's be honest, most books just feel like books. There's not much special in terms of tactile presentation. How do you feel as a person, as a human being publishing it today, with the knowledge you have of all this?
Well, first of all, what's the name of the shop you mentioned?
Alienated Majesty.
We'll
It's
walk
just
by it
up
on the way
the
up.
street.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll make sure that happens. Figure it out.
Well, I'm very confident about the future of print. I think the kind of bookmaking techniques that are maybe visible in the shop you described are a kind of return to letterpress technology. It's happening in schools, in universities, in art schools, but also more generally. And as this hardware has fallen out of, or fell out of commercial use, it got kind of redistributed into culture, and lots of people are using it now. I think in a kind of dance with the digital, or as a response to the digital, and as a form that can make you work slowly and precisely and carefully and meditatively. So I think the fate of those apparently lost craft skills that Cobden Sanderson was worrying about, I think we're in a moment where they're doing quite well. The actual experience of printing the book that's out there was super interesting as an insight into everything that I was talking about, really, because it was very clear that I was just one agent among many who were making this book. I mean, I wrote the text, but then as soon as I handed the text in, there were designers, and there were editors, and there were print shop people, and my comments were of some use. The American publisher sent me 6 title pages, and they said, what do you think? And I said, these 4 are good, but definitely not these 2. And then the one they used was one of those 2. So I realized it was a nice moment that one makes these arguments about collaboration, about the author just being a single agent in a larger group, but then you really feel it when you print the book. But broadly, I'm confident about the printed book. In the UK, sales of printed books are high and are increasing. I think of my students bring books into the seminar generally to read rather than laptops and screens. So I think the qualities that print has, the things that printed books can do, get sharper and more visible as they exist alongside the digital, I think. It's different kind of temporality, its calmness, its slowness, and also its capacity to kind of endure. I mean, such utopian rhetoric about digital preservation. I've got a desk at home with a drawer full of floppy disks of my PhD that I can't read anymore. The British Library has this fascinating room, maybe you guys have one here, of dead media technologies. So Philips Laserdisc, Betamax recorders, DAT tapes, these kind of 80s, 90s, noughties technologies that were going to endure, and now they're down to the last machine, with the idea that at some point in the future, some data from an interesting author will be recovered in that format, and so but they're kind of churches to the obsolescence of lots of these digital forms. Whereas if you go to upstairs and order a book from 1500, it still works. It's a form that you can understand and intuitively work with. And as long as things don't burn or get flooded, books endure to a remarkable extent, I think. So I think there's also a powerful argument about print and preservation that has kind of got obscured with the idea that, well, where is the cloud? I don't even know what the cloud is.
Well, with the cloud, let's thank our speaker. Thank you very much.